Welcome to the HR Dialogues, a show where we talk about HR and the future of work. I'm your host, Dr. Dieter Veldsman, and today I'm being joined by Sophia Matveeva, CEO and founder of Tech For Non-Techies. Welcome to the HR Dialogues, where we learn from people practitioners as they navigate the emerging world of work. Sophia, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Dieter. I'm very honored to be here.
It's lovely to have you. And before we deep dive, what brings you to the HR Dialogues today? Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
So I run a training company called Tech For Non-Techies. And my aim is to help smart people who are not coders succeed in the digital age without having to code. Because I find that, there is the left brain side of the population. They love coding and, they're really finding great opportunities. And then there's kind of the rest of us, the right-brained people, the people who are really good with people skills, maybe with writing, with communication, with EQ. And sometimes we're forcing ourselves to learn to code and we hate it. And I want to show people that actually, as long as you know the fundamentals of tech, the fundamentals of AI, you don't have to become a coder to become immensely successful in the digital age.
Absolutely love that. And I think that we've seen such a big transition as well over the last couple of years of what are those core skills. And we are going to definitely deep dive into that in terms of the skill sets required to be successful in the AI age. Sophia, before I lead us into the episode itself, we like to get to know our guests a little bit better on the HR Dialogue. So I'd love to hear from you. What has been some of the best career advice that you've ever received up to now?
I think the best one was to be memorable. So I remember before I started business school, so I went to one of the top business schools in the world. It's Chicago Booth. It's where Barack Obama was teaching before he went into politics. So it's a big deal. And before I started, I remember reaching out to a mentor of mine who was an investor, like a really high profile investor in London. And he had gone to Columbia Business School. And so I said to him, I'm about to go and, make this huge financial investment and huge investment in time. How, in this business school, how do I get the best ROI? And I thought he was going to say, well, you have to read these books. You have to do this and time management and blah, blah, blah. And he literally just said, be memorable. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, look, I've just had my 10-year business school reunion. And, these are Columbia MBAs meeting up in New York. So they're all kind of hoity-toity successful people, right? And he says, we didn't really remember what people did. But what mattered was, do you remember the person? Because, jobs evolve, we change careers, things change. But if you are the person that people remember, if you reach out to them 3 years later, they'll be like, oh yeah, I remember them. Like, they were great. Of course I will give them some time or help them out or introduce them to somebody.
I think we see that a lot in organizations as well, right? I think the sense of how do you position yourself in certain areas so that you are in the know, that you are connected. And I think definitely in the age that we work in today, that social connected and familiarity is still such an important part of how we work. Sophia, I think that really leads us very nicely into the topic. And we know artificial intelligence has been a hot topic over the last couple of years, and I think it's really spiked over the last 24 months or so. And what we have been seeing is a lot of organizations have been investing significantly in AI upskilling and in AI training. On the one side, we see from our own research, from an HR point of view, a lot of HR professionals say, almost 60% say it hasn't been incorporated into the practice and process level of what they do, whilst a lot of the adoption actually lies at the individual level. Me, my work, my tasks, my activities, but it's not necessarily translating into return on investment for the broader organization beyond individual level productivity.
I think there's this expectation that when a technology comes out, like it's here and now it's going to change the world. And I think it will, but not within 24 hours. Because whenever there is any kind of technological transformation, whether it's digital transformation or, the printing press being invented, whatever it was, you essentially have two components. You have the tech thing being invented, and then you have humans using it. And which one do you think is more difficult?
Well, I'm very biased, but obviously the human component.
Right? Okay. Like, who knows better how difficult it is to get people to do something than HR people, right? Dealing with people, that's the most difficult thing. And I think, Silicon Valley companies have so much PR that they kind of convince us that it's all about the tech, but I think we know better. We know that, it's getting humans to do things. That's the most difficult thing. So first of all, don't lose hope. We are actually at the beginning of this transformation. So the people who are even experimenting with it, you're literally on the frontiers. I would recommend to people and to companies to start with a very specific thing. Because essentially, if we think about generative AI, kind of like the invention of electricity. When it was first invented, so it was in, I think, middle of the 19th century. So it took about 100 years for it to reach mass adoption. And I think we need to think about kind of that adoption curve in the same sense. So, when it first gets invented, people are like, oh, this is interesting. What does this have to do with me? And then it becomes relevant when somebody sees a use case and they're like, okay, I can use electricity to automate a bit of my production process in my factory. And then they start saving some money and they have some efficiencies and they think, oh, okay, I'm using it on one machine. Let me hook up 2 machines to this thing. And then eventually the entire factory changes. But that takes time. So let's take the same approach, because AI right now is a bit like this general technology. And I do think that there's this mistaken expectation from CEOs that, well, we're giving you this thing and now you're all going to become really productive. Yeah. Off you go. And we're like, okay, what am I going to do now?
A couple of things that I'm noticing working with some of our clients, and I think you spot on around a lot of people are taking this approach. And I think it's also in the public media, we see these statistics around how quickly some of the adoption of these tools have grown. I think adoption and benefit is not necessarily the same thing. So we are very much at the beginning of that hype curve where there's also a misunderstanding about, I think, what AI can do and what it cannot do and how it will be integrated into work in future. And exactly to your point, it's just because it is at such a global scale and so accessible to people all of a sudden, I think we've started to see this rising expectation that we are being left behind. Whereas I love the point that you mentioned that we are actually still at the beginning of that race of adoption and what that's going to look like. I think the need to focus is really, really crucial and important, and not to try to change the world with your first use case, but to do something. A lot of the advice that we give to some of our members is take a practice or a process that you know really, really, really well and go and apply it there and see what difference it can make and start building that confidence and that competence over time.
I really do actually have empathy for the corporate leaders who are signing these contracts, because there is so much pressure on them from, Wall Street analysts. Yeah. There's so much pressure from boards because every CEO is being asked, what's your AI strategy? They don't know, but they know they need one. And so it's easier to just say, oh, yes, we've just signed a contract with OpenAI. Yeah. Okay. That kind of keeps the dogs at bay a bit. But what it does do is that it pushes the problem down from the top. The person at the top has signed the contract, they've got the AI strategy. It pushes it down to basically everybody who is not sitting in the C-suite, because then it's like, well, it's up to you now.
But I think it is something that we've seen before. It's helpful to remember that a couple of years ago, with cloud, for example, there was also this hype around that if you are not there by this point in time, you will be lagging behind and you'll be dead in the water. There is this need to have the discussion around why and purpose. Why do we want to utilize this in our particular organization? And then I think it links very strongly to your idea of what's the problem that you're trying to solve? Who's the person that is dealing with this particular problem? And what is the context within which they are trying to solve this? I want to move a little bit into the comment that you made around skills, right? Because there's definitely this component around people need to learn how to do prompt design and prompt engineering over time, etc. But what are some of the other skill sets that you see when you work with people around upskilling them on AI that is crucially important, that you think people need to take note of?
It's not the only thing. If we just take digital transformation as a whole, what I really want people to really take away from this is that essentially there are 2 different mindsets, and they're kind of opposite to each other. The traditional business mindset, let's take, the mindset of a lawyer, because we've all had to deal with a lawyer at some point, right? That a lawyer's output has to be perfect. If they give you a contract, it has to be watertight, because that is the whole point of hiring a lawyer, right? And yes, you can change a contract, but it's very painful. It's very unpleasant. It's often quite expensive. And so in the traditional business world, we're very focused on perfection. We're very focused on planning. We do a lot of work behind the scenes, and then we create something and it's like, ta-da, there's this amazing thing. Then we get into the digital world. The digital world is much more experimental, and essentially you have an idea. The best thing to do is not to sit there and strategize, but to make a simple version of that idea. So maybe make a test app, maybe make a test website, then show it to some people, give it to a small number of your target users, see how they react, and based on that reaction, you change. And so perfection literally is impossible, because you can only make assumptions about what people want, and you can only really figure that out when you give it to people, which is completely opposite to what the law is doing. The law is not like, oh, look, so here's this, let's just kind of use it and see if we get sued. And if we get sued, I'll change it. Right? That's not how it works. And both of these attitudes, kind of the iterative attitude and the perfection attitude, they are both really good if they're used appropriately. And again, I think, we've all heard about agile transformation, and that agile is the right way to go. And that's not true. Agile, which is this process of experimentation and moving forward, it's great for some circumstances, but it's not great for others. And so what I would want people to understand is that there are these two different mindsets. They both have their place in business, and you need to know kind of, where am I really strong?
Yeah, and I mean, it comes back to me, right, in terms of that fit for purpose application. And I think context will always matter, right? And if I, bring it back to the HR world, very often HR practitioners struggle to make that leap towards the more experiential, failing forward type of thinking, because HR has also been a profession, similar to your example from a legal point of view, that has a very, very strong compliance, high stakes. You need to get certain things right. Nobody wants you to experiment on an employment contract, for example. Yeah, and that's not necessarily something we need to do. I do think, though, it is also a real skill to be able to differentiate, to say, what do I apply when, and what mindset do I utilize and approach. And I really think the skill also to, almost to be able to problem solve and apply the right tool for the right setting in the right way is going to be such an important component. You and I earlier offline spoke about some of the research that we've been busy with, and something that was quite interesting for me in the HR domain was a lot of HR learns AI through self exploration, which I think is really, really great. However, on the other side, it also showcases that self exploration, you kind of just learn from the small little circle within which you are exposed to, as opposed to that engagement with others, putting things out there, getting that feedback type of mentality, learning from others. And I think one of the key things we need to get right is the sharing of use cases and the sharing of knowledge as people start progressing forward. Because I think at the pace that AI is going, nobody can figure it out on their own or by their lonesome self. And I think that's where communities are going to play a very, very key role to start shifting and pushing people forward into that next era, if I can almost call it that. But a lot of that has to do with mindset.
You know, mindset, and also, yes, seeing examples. But what I wonder is, how keen are people to tell their boss that they got the job done using AI in, 3 hours less? Maybe they're like, okay, I've done this in 3 hours less. I'm going to go and have a nice lunch. Like, I don't want to give those 3 hours away to my work. And, like, we're human. This is a pretty reasonable thing to do. So I wouldn't, let's kind of manage our expectations of what people are really willing to share, because maybe they don't want people to know basically how much free time they have left now, which I think, is totally fine. So then maybe we don't only confine the use cases to work examples, but actually we see how our friends and our families are using it. So, for example, my mother is an academic, and her really good friend is also an academic. And her friend started using it to basically start seeing patterns in some of her students' essays. And because literally you can upload a bunch of things, you can upload essays or reports into AI, and then it can spot patterns for you. And then my mother thought, oh, this is really good. Okay, let me try to do that too.
There is still that stigma, right? In terms of, I think that in some organizations, people feel, and we hear that quite a bit in terms of that they say it feels like they're cheating if they're using it and gaining this time. And I think that's something that we will overcome over time when people get more used to that, that it's actually a good thing, in terms of us shifting and moving forward. I think on the other side, what's also started to happen a bit is that there is almost this component of AI shaming that I've also seen on the other side of the coin, where people are not that afraid, but they don't want to ask because I think the expectation is already there that they need to know and need to be utilizing this as well. So I think there is almost again for organizations a narrative that they need to start steering the organization a little bit more around what's acceptable, what do we promote, what do we celebrate around the utilization thereof, and what's the guardrails, right? Because a lot of people don't use it out of fear for doing something wrong, especially when we get to professions like HR, legal, where some of the stakes around getting it right first time is quite high.
And the shame is such a big thing, and we actually deal with it all the time. So one of our courses, it's Tech for Non-Technical Professionals. And I remember I approached a bunch of big tech companies and also tech startups, kind of Series A that have some money, to say, look, your employees, your people in legal, your people in HR, your non-technical people, they need this because they're surrounded by tech people all the time, but they haven't had this training. And so they're kind of sitting there. They don't know, they might not know what an API is. They're kind of confused about what a server is. You don't need them to be a server engineer, but they do need to have that comfort level to understand what's going on around them. And a lot of the feedback that I've had from the tech companies, big and small, is, oh, no, we've got it covered. We do these trainings. And I'm like, yeah, you don't, because your people are coming to us and paying us with their cash to take our courses. And the capitalist in me is like, okay, great, there's a use case, come and buy them. But I think if your employees are paying their own money to take these courses, and then it's kind of immoral for you not to provide that education. And I've often spoken to our students who are who are paying for these courses themselves, and I say, we could write you a letter, so you take that letter and you can get at least some of the reimbursement back. And some of the feedback that I've had was, well, I don't want them to know I don't know this stuff. And I'm like, well, you work in HR. How are you supposed to know this? If you weren't born knowing this. But there is so much shame that, okay, we're now in this world of digital transformation. We're now in this world of AI, especially if you get a job at a tech startup or you start working in a big tech company. There's this expectation that once you walk through the doors, you'll just kind of inhale it.
To build transparency and trust in the organization, that it's okay and there's no expectation for everybody to absolutely know everything right from the get-go. Now, I think there is a component there that we also see around this expectation pertaining to digital agility and mindset. So I think there is a responsibility on the individual to make sure that over time they do gain those skills and learn the appropriate language and know how to utilize these different elements. But I also think working in a very distributed world, very often people also underestimate the knowledge that people require when joining a new company, when they start shifting things like tool sets or tech stacks and those types of things, etc., which I think is very underestimated when we think about traditional onboarding practices from an HR point of view. Sophia, I want to shift a little bit before we start wrapping up in terms of what advice do you have for HR professionals, first in their individual capacity, if a lot of what we've spoken about today rings true for them, where they find themselves, and then also around what can they do in their organizations to help move this story of hope pertaining to AI forward?
I think showing leadership, showing that leaders, including HR leaders, are learning, that sets a really, really good example. And so I'll give you an example. There is a lady who gave an interview on my podcast, Tech For Non-Techies, who used to be the chief technology officer of Microsoft in the US. So literally one of the leading technologists in the entire world. And she talked about how she kept on doing courses to learn aspects of tech. And so she gave this example. She said, well, I was a cybersecurity engineer. That's kind of how I rose up through the ranks. And then when I was a CTO, I realized actually I have this gap on design thinking that, this is important, but it's never something I really delved into. So I took a course. And I remember thinking, this is wonderful. And it's so wonderful that she actually shares this widely on a podcast because, if the CTO is taking courses, then it's fine for all of us to take courses. And she said, if I don't know something, I take a course. And I think if we have the top leadership saying, I have taken this course, then basically everybody else will be like, oh, it's okay for me to not know something and then to, maybe apply for funding to take a course, listen to a podcast and so on. So that's number one. And I think hopefully that shouldn't be too difficult, because if your leadership are already taking courses, just get them to tell people about it. So that's number one. And in terms of kind of what you can be doing, I would say take one task and start using, I prefer Claude, but some people prefer ChatGPT. Just pick one. It really doesn't matter. And use it for a narrow use case. So there are, I gave you the email use case. You could just take a bunch of reports that you have, like take basically lots of written things from different people and ask to see patterns. Maybe rehearse a difficult conversation, but take one thing. And once you see some benefit from that one thing, then you can expand. But don't stress too much about, okay, everything I do, my entire day needs to get changed. One step at a time, and then you'll get there.
No, I think very practical advice, Sophia. So maybe for me to wrap up, a couple of things that really stood out for me from our conversation that I think is very valuable to note. The first one is, be clear on the purpose of why you want to utilize AI and find a simple way to start that is practical and that is very specific to who you are as an individual, the person, and the context within which you find yourself in. Love the fact that you spoke about that there's a lot of hype about this, but we do need to cut through the noise a bit in terms of seeing that we are at the beginning of the journey and it is a story of hope. It is a good news story, but we are still having to tread the path there to able to build that confidence and competence to be able to get there. Loved some of the practical use cases that you shared with the learners there, as well as the fact that as leaders in organizations, we need to role model how we are also continuously learning and adapting to this changing environment, because we cannot expect everybody to know everything all of the time. And it's better to have that open conversation around how are we building those skill sets for the future. Love the fact also that AI is a change in mindset and it is a change around being more open towards experimentation, trying new things, but doing that in a way that we can continuously learn. So, Sophia, thank you so much from my side. Really enjoyed our conversation. Where can people follow the great work that you do? What's the easiest way to get hold of you?
So LinkedIn or the Tech For Non-Techies podcast. So if you're listening to podcasts already and you want to delve deeper in what we're discussing here, Tech For Non-Techies is the place to go. Or just connect with me on LinkedIn, and I have a LinkedIn newsletter, which again, if you prefer learning in the written form, it's there for you too.
Perfect. Sophia, from my side, thank you very much. And to everybody listening, we'll see you on the next episode of the HR Dialogues. Bye-bye.